If you think about building web applications, what you end up building is a lot of marshalling. In other words, how do I get data from the database to the user, and then how do you get it from the user back to the database, right? So that's a marshalling problem. And if you build web apps, you end up doing marshalling all day long, right? Because it's like every single screen that you have a form or input or a table that shows data is really just a problem of getting the data back and forth between the database and the user. And so the question was, could you simplify this? Could you make some vocabulary where you could directly connect to the database and bypass the complexity around it? And so the idea was add extra vocabulary to HTML. Right? And so this is where the goal started. And I teamed up with another person called Adam Abrams, and he was more of a front-end developer and back-end as well. And so we kind of wanted to build those two pieces. I think the original project was actually called the Vanilla Binder, and then we made a website called Get Angular. It was a mixture of a front-end framework and also a database, so think like Firebase on it. And I wanted to have a system which non-developers could use to build applications. So it really wasn't meant for developers. It was really meant for somebody like a designer, somebody who knows HTML, but doesn't necessarily know how to code. And so the idea was like, could you add extra vocabulary, extra attributes, extra tag names into the HTML syntax so that that extra vocabulary could do very simple applications like make a guest book or create an appointment or just basic storage capabilities. It turned out that the framework part of it, like the idea of having an extended vocabulary that you can create for building web apps, was useful to us building actual web apps, right? And so we kind of dropped the storage part, and it's just started focusing on the framework as it is known today.
We were building an internal tool that was the back end for how we let everybody on any Google product submit feedback about where we might be able to do better. And we were struggling because we had a small team and we had to be able to web front end. And Mishko was on this team, and he said that we had been struggling on this for months, and he said, I can rebuild the whole thing in 2 weeks with this little side project I have, this new little JavaScript framework. And at the time, Mishko was a Java expert. He was known for helping people build testability and construct Java architecture the right way. And so my thought was like, well, he probably doesn't know anything about JavaScript, but why not? Like 2 weeks, of course I can afford that. In 2 weeks, using this side project that I've been working on.
Yes, I made a boost like that. I didn't quite make it, did I?
Not quite.
It took me 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks.
Mishko was he had been building this project out in the open source. He was thinking of going off and just doing this as a separate company, leaving Google and focusing on Get Angular. I had my selling hat on. I was like, no, man, that's a crazy idea. Google's got a ton of resources. You can do your startup, but do it here. I didn't have headcount to fund the Angular team per se. I had to scrape and squint and steal from other projects to get a couple folks. And I pulled together enough headcount for 3 people to be on the project. And after Mishko and a couple of contributors started on the project, we were able to hire some external folks. One of the first people we hired was this guy, Igor Minar.
Are we frameworked out?
I think so.
So if you took the prototype of Get Angular or AngularJS as it was shaping and put it in front of web developers and showed them how you can build very rich, very interactive UIs with it, they were hooked because they understood that, first of all, they can write the UIs in much less code than what they were typically used to. And secondly, the code was running on the client side, which meant that you could build much more interactive UIs than full stack applications. Applications that required a full page reload were rendered on the server side with very little interactivity on the client side. So both this productivity boost as well as the possibility to build much richer and more dynamic applications were very appealing to developers at the time. And we needed people to help us build it. So from early days, we worked with whoever wanted to contribute to AngularJS. We spent time mentoring them. We spent time giving the feedback on the changes they were making. We spent time on calls with people and we tried to see who are the people that had the passion, the motivation, and drive to help us make Angular better. There was this dude on GitHub that was sending us pull request contributions that were way better than anything we've seen before. So we set up a call with him, talked to him to find out who he is. I asked him, like, who are you? And he introduced himself as a trumpet player.
There was like zero planning, zero top-down like influence from Google or direction. But like I felt like we're totally doing whatever we wanted. Mishko was always super excited about any idea. I love that about him. Like, yeah, I would bring new idea how to get rid of the form factory or whatever because I felt like it didn't fit the right design, you know. And he would just get excited. I would like rewrite the whole thing in one day before Igor got in the office, you know. And like there was no like formal approvals or planning. We were all doing everything, writing documentation, later doing talks at conferences and stuff, working with the customers, and like it was kind of messy, but it was kind of magical actually.
The early days were both exciting but also frustrating because we had a lot of autonomy to work on AngularJS. But we were also, at the same time, not taken seriously by most engineering teams. We were seen as this experiment that was given some mandate, but there was a lot of uncertainty that came with it because we didn't know if the project would go on for a year, 2 years, 5 years, or if it would be shut down tomorrow. We tried to talk to Google Maps, we tried to talk to Gmail, like all these big product engineering teams. And they were kind of like looking at what we were doing and like, yeah, this is a good toy, good luck with that. We need much more sophisticated solutions for applications.
Our first review for Angular, we thought it was great. We had been using it on our project for a while, and so we wanted to take it to our directors and our VP, hopefully get some more funding for it, get more people who could work on the project, and at least get some high-level air cover. One of the guys in the room was one of the famous architects and leaders of Google from technology standpoint, this guy Urs Holz. And so after we'd gotten done with the presentation, we'd showed how it reduced the amount of code that you would take, how it was easy to evolve a system from one point to another, why it was really easy for developers to get in on it. We concluded the presentation and Urs told us very bluntly, "You are all liars."
And that was actually one of the quotes that we leaned into in some of the presentations. We were like, yeah, we were called liars, but here, like, it actually is real. But it was an interesting challenge. Like, we were given this challenge, we were called liars, but also, if you don't want to be called liars, go prove yourself. Go make this, actually show us that this can happen. So we got permission to keep on going and exploring this direction and building AngularJS, but it didn't really come with any additional resources. It didn't come with any additional help that would make this happen. And this is why we leaned so much on the open source community to help us.
I remember when we launched Angular 1.0, and we had a tracker to see like the traffic on the website. And we were hoping to get some modest bump and that people would pick it up. But it went crazy. It was like a hockey stick from the get-go. And this was where we got a little excited and a little scared because we hadn't really anticipated this much attention. Like from 1.0 all the way up through 1.3, it was nothing but a skyrocket ride. All right, folks. Hey, we can barely believe this is happening. Can you guys believe it's happening? Yeah. Finally.
It's unreal, isn't it?
It's unreal for us.
I'm in denial.
I'm in denial. All right.
There was an office hours with the Angular team around Google I/O, and I went, and like most of the people in the room, I was totally fanboying at Brad and Igor and Mishko's presence. And I got in a line, there was like a line to talk to these guys, and I was nervous, like I was in an ultimate fanboy moment. And I got to the front, and I was excited, and I was like, hey, my name's Aaron. I know some people that you like. I know Joe Eames. I know John Lindquist. I know Dave Geddes. And we've all thought about building, an Angular-only conference. And we were hoping that maybe you guys would come. Immediately, Brad was like, yeah, well, actually, we're going to send the whole team if you do that. And so I immediately recognized, okay, if they send the whole team, this is going to be different. And we hoped the community would care. Like, we hoped they'd be excited. We thought once we put the link up for tickets, we'd get some interest. Before we had even had a chance to refresh the page one time, they were all pending. And we slowly started seeing those shopping carts complete their purchases. And that was when we realized, oh my God, we just sold out the conference in 10 seconds. I think Angular's real selling point was you just include it on a web page and you could instantly start writing HTML only that had JavaScript functionality. And that had never been done before. The infamous where you could just type in an input box and it would spell it backwards on the next line. And you could do that without any JavaScript, just HTML. That demo was something that the web had never, ever seen before. And so I think some of the really cool first demos were so mind-blowing that AngularJS just immediately stood out as an easier to use framework.
If you are building a solution with developers in mind, friction has to be as close to zero as possible from the get-go. And AngularJS got that right, in my opinion. You were able to start an application very fast. You could use a CDN, you could drop in some script tags, and you had access to this wonderful system that gave you two-way data binding, gave you dependency injection, gave you directives, and a way to start building something non-trivial without having to do a ton of work yourself. And I think that there was something really nice about that. It was at a time when people were, they were comfortable, they were used to using jQuery. They were also trying to look for more opinionated architectural solutions. And I feel like AngularJS really helped them see okay, well, here are many problems we're all running into. Let's try to give you something that includes more batteries by default. So I think that it did a good job at trying to give you a slightly better path to building something non-trivial.
When we reached Angular 1.3, this is when it was getting super big externally and internally. And we got reorged under the ads part of the organization. And they were heavily invested in GWT, but they were looking for something better and something easier. The folks, the tech leads over there, were really still into Java, and they loved the type safetiness and a lot of the things that we now get out of TypeScript, but we couldn't back at the time. And they wanted something that seemed a lot like GWT with the development tools and all of those nice things that they have for Java, but they wanted it with the Angular framework. The thing that led us down the path to Angular 2 was really their requirement that we build it on Dart.
Well, Dart is a new programming language and a platform. It includes libraries and programming tools for writing structured web applications. So basically, Dart is a new project that has the goal of improving the productivity of web developers.
And I just remember the day when Brad Green came and he was like, "Okay, guys, bad news." I don't know if he said bad news, but
he did.
But he
and I
was
almost quit. I remember I almost quit.
He
on
was,
the spot over there.
yeah. It was a very difficult conversation because we didn't feel that it was the right thing to do, and we had no choice.
It actually ended up being a way that we probably saved the Angular team from being disbanded, but it was really hard to swallow, where we were super passionate about JavaScript and all of the flexibility that it gave developers. And to them, it looked like I was shoving them down a trough where, it looked like death to them, probably. I think if we had not been pushed by the Dart team to go this way, we would not have gone down the TypeScript path. Mishko and Igor might view this differently. They might be right. My view of it is that we were so passionate about the freedom from types, and we actually worked it into some of our talks, where we sold against GWT, the Google Web Toolkit, for its requiring you to use types. And one of the things we used to say is types are for people who like to do a lot of typing. And we totally changed our theory on this once we had seen some of the work that we were able to get done with Dart. And I think it took that exposure in our context, in Angular itself, to understand how types were actually critical to building large-scale applications. And large-scale applications, again, they were not the target of Angular from the beginning. And so it's totally understandable why we would have had a different perspective. But as we were serving larger teams and having folks who had long living applications you had to revise over many years, types became actually a critical thing that we knew our developers needed and that we knew we had to bring them along on the journey with us.
So we knew we needed a type system. And so the original idea was to just add assertions, kind of a runtime type checker that basically, as the code is running, it's asserting that, yeah, you have the object here that you think you have. And so this kind of gave birth to AdScript.
We want to talk about Angular. Specifically, I want to talk about how we are not building a language. Just to make this clear, we are not building a language. And the thing we're not doing, that's called AdScript.
I never really thought that AdScript was necessarily a big thing that we should be promoting, but somehow we kind of went on the conference and basically said like, hey, you know, we were thinking about this AdScript thing. It got attention of Microsoft with TypeScript, and they kind of reached out to us and say, hey, what you're building is, you know, we already have a system for it. So instead of building yet another thing and fragmenting the ecosystem, like maybe we should work together and come up with a common solution for it. And so this is kind of the birth of the cooperation between Angular team and the TypeScript team.
And the funny thing about citruses is that when you take the seed and you grow it, you will get a citrus, but it will not be a lemon. It will be something else.
We announced that we were going to do Angular 2, and it didn't go very well.
There was a presentation we did where we had tombstones up for a bunch of the concepts that we were retiring in Angular 1. Probably not the most sensitive way to introduce change to a community.
Tobias, I'm sorry to tell you that we killed the controller.
Real.
Yes.
Paying attention and looking elsewhere. And so we have a bunch of photos of that. It's very funny.
We get in a lot of trouble at work, actually. We're really not. One of the engineering managers always messages Jessica and I, like, I see you both.
I hadn't actually seen the announcement yet, but I had to watch it as soon as I got home because Igor was obsessively talking about, like, what do you think we could have done differently? And like, and
I mean, one to two was rough. One to two was very rough. I mean, you finally gain your stripes into feeling comfortable at your job place. You're the Angular guy. They changed the entire framework almost overnight, you know, and there was not the RFC process at the time or anything like that. And you're like, man, now what do I do? And and the thing is, like, to me, it got to the point, it was right when we finished like a digital transformation for a company, you know, and we felt so cool about it. And then all of a sudden they said like Angular has just changed. We're like, okay, that's like maybe a minor change here and there, but the entire thing changed. Like the way you approach it, TypeScript got introduced and everything like that. And basically, like, I remember one of my managers looking at me and saying like, okay, are we ready for 2? I'm like, I'm not even ready for like coming to work tomorrow. You know, so don't ask me about the 2.
Just release the framework and leave it with these features, okay? And then add more afterwards. So we'll be done by 2016 and that's it, okay? Okay? Okay?
Is that we're building a command line interface. Angular CLI. Material design with component routing. Observables. You can do functional reactive programming.
Could we move the framework itself into the web worker?
Combining an XML template with data to create a native UI component view.
But at the time that Angular was released, I was in a very lucky situation to not have to maintain an AngularJS application and just be allowed to work on Angular and dive into the framework. I was at NG Europe 2016, where some of the folks were talking about the things they have planned for Angular. And it was like, yes, this is so obvious. Okay, why didn't we have this in AngularJS?
But on the other hand, I was just excited because what I mentioned earlier, the fact when they introduced the CLI at NG Europe, I was like, yes, I don't want to deal with Webpack. I think in the first package was System.js. So having the Angular CLI, NX, those kind of tools, abstracting that entirely from me is something that I very much appreciate. But the migration process was rough. And I think for a lot of people that was really scary, and in the end forced them rather to look in other directions, like you said, React, which seemed less scary than having to deal with breaking changes and the fear of going through something like that then again afterwards.
We moved to Silicon Valley to be in the action, to be around people that were obsessed with technology and building, and we took advantage of that by going to all the meetups that we could. And so we went to Angular meetups all the time in San Francisco and the Valley, and we found a lot of people that were obsessed like we were with this technology. There's things like custom directives, there's routing strategies, there's rendering strategies, there's lazy loading, great state management with NGRX. So all of these things that you would normally have to piecemeal together with other languages and frameworks were out of the box with Angular. We were building 15 products inside of one. We had a very small team. It was under 10 engineers. So we had to build really fast. And TypeScript allowed us with kind of type checking to be able to find a lot of these trivial bugs very proactively without having a huge QA team. And fortunately for us, we started with Angular 2, so we didn't have those same frustrations. But we saw that a lot. And when we were hiring people, when we would go talk at some of these technical talks, there was a huge frustration around what happened with AngularJS to Angular 2.
Don't call it a rebrand, because it wasn't one. Yeah. I would be doing workshops often where I was introducing people to Angular. And especially in that state of learning Angular and learning any framework in general, you're searching constantly. Like half of learning programming is your Google foo. And so if you are just saying, how do you do an Angular for loop? And then you have some that are AngularJS. And it's like, okay, is this Angular 1? Is this Angular 2? So constantly I was like, every search would be, how do I do this thing Angular 2? Then you go away from 2. And then it's just like, okay, what do I search now? And the messaging was always, it's just Angular, it's just Angular. And that wasn't true. Like, unfortunately, you couldn't just search Angular. If they would have just pivoted the name at that point and made Google JS. No, I'm just kidding. Like, what could have come of, like, you know, would have had that dip?
Anyway, long story short, developers were pissed after the presentation came out because everybody was like, oh, like Angular team is just breaking everything, and I invested all this time into my application and my skills, and now it's all gone. And it's like, we're like, no, we're making it better. No, it didn't land that way at all. And it took us many years to this day. Like, I think a lot of the perception that people have around Angular is because of how we communicated the transition from AngularJS to Angular version 2. And the fact that we felt like this was the right thing to do for everybody. And I think in retrospect, everybody would agree that it was the right thing to do. But just the way we messaged it was not right. And it caused so much harm that to this day, Angular is still recovering from it. I think we all realized that Angular v2 was a mistake. Not in what we were trying to do, but in how we were trying to do it. And it was too late to course correct, so we just had to go with whatever we had and just somehow just make it work and slap it all together and ship it. Because we were running out of time, developers are running out of patience. Like, people at Google really wanted to use this thing and it was unstable for the longest time, so we just had to ship it. So we did ship something knowing that this is not what we wanted to ship, but it was the best thing that we were able to ship at the time. And this was 2016.
I think AngularJS was a project of passion. Angular 2 was not. It was just like the thing to do.
I think it was just like too many chefs in the kitchen, too many
chefs,
constraints, too many mandates, too many... Like, we were just overwhelmed by our own ambition and by all of these artificial mandates and constraints that were placed on us. Like, you have to make it work with Dart. On the flip side, with us using Dart, we also were funded.
We actually grew the team tremendously. We went from like 3 or 4 people into about 12 people. It seemed like almost overnight.
So I joined the team at the time we were switching from AtScript to TypeScript. Someone wrote a compiler called TS to Dart, and the idea was that Angular would be written in TypeScript, or I guess previously AtScript, but eventually became TypeScript. This compiler would translate that TypeScript code to Dart, and so they wouldn't actually have to write 2 frameworks. You could have one framework that was authored in one language, but that could offer an experience in both. One of the challenges of building the code this way, of compiling TypeScript to Dart, was that you're limited to the kind of overlap between the 2 languages, right? The set of things that can be expressed in both. And that created friction on both sides. So for the Dart experience, it was never a really idiomatic Dart experience. You couldn't use things like factory constructors that were built into the Dart language. And one of the kind of selling points of the Dart language, the improvements over the JavaScript experience, because you couldn't do those things in TypeScript. And in the TypeScript side, a lot of people wonder today, like, why Angular uses null all over the place instead of undefined. It's because Dart has no undefined.
It wasn't great. And eventually, the Dart team was just fed up with us, and they were like, oh, we'll just take over Angular Dart, and we are forking. And we're like, yes, let's do it, because that is the right...
No, that's not how I remember it. Like, I was upset about the fact that they were forking it. But in retrospect, I'm glad they did. In retrospect...
But we didn't know what it meant, right?
We didn't know what it meant, but like, I think...
there was so much like funding that came with the mandate to support.
But I think for me, it was like, I spent so much time and effort making sure that like it worked in this special way so that both things can be supported. And now you're like taking the fork away. Like, it just felt personally But like in retrospect, I'm like, it's the best thing ever happened.
No, it was the best thing that ever happened. Like, if that didn't happen, then we would not be talking about Angular today. And the only way forward was make lots of small breaking changes over a long period of time to completely abandon what Angular v2 was and rebuild it to what we wanted it to be.
2 engineers from Amadeus in France who were working on Angular with us. They're kind of external team members. They come and visit the team in Mountain View, as they have a few times. And they give a demo of this prototype that they've built of a different approach to rendering, a different kind of design for how to structure the internals of a framework. And it was the 4th prototype that they've built, so they were using the Roman numerals IV. And Miško saw this demo and fell in love with it. He had been thinking quite a bit on what do we do next? How do we make the framework smaller? How do we make the framework more tree shakeable? So one of the things we talk quite a bit about is dead code elimination. If you have 30 features and users are only using 10 of them, how do you make sure that all of the code to support the other 20 that they're not using doesn't have to be shipped to the browser, because that's expensive. That makes the application bundle much bigger than it needs to be. Miško saw the Ivy design and realized that it really put tree shaking at the heart of the design behind the framework. And he thought that this was what Angular needed to take the next step.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about Ivy. The original intent was that it would be a relatively small project in scope, that it would ship in Angular version 7. It really ended up just becoming a textbook case of scope creep and turned into effectively a rewrite of the entire framework. From start to finish, 7 releases, so that's about 3.5 years. Because it started off as a small project that grew in scope kind of inch by inch, I think there wasn't a lot of consensus on the team that it was the best thing that the team could be doing. Some people felt that it was too much of a lateral move. It certainly did have a lot of technological enhancements for the framework. Miško in particular saw as necessary for Angular to be able to continue to evolve. But from a developer experience standpoint, moving from Vue Engine to Ivy mostly felt the same. Maybe faster performance, maybe smaller bundle sizes, but developers don't really feel those things viscerally. If you spend 3 years working on this huge internal refactoring and rewrite, and at the end of it, the framework still feels the same to the developer, it is kind of underwhelming.
I think the trap was that it's really easy to prototype something and to prototype even a lot of it, but it's really, really hard to get that last 20%. So you can get it to 80% really quick, but the details are what mess you up. Another huge piece of it was, as Mishka was saying, like the car is still running. We didn't want to break the world again, right? With AngularJS and Angular, we had this huge, schism in the community. And so the goal for Ivy was to change all of the internals of the engine without requiring any changes from users and how they were using Angular. But what we quickly realized was that there were so many tiny little things that were undocumented that had a huge impact on how the code would run. The order that lifecycle hooks would run in as components relate to each other, that was never something that was guaranteed by the framework. It was just an implementation detail of the framework. If you moved from a breadth first method to a depth first method, it would completely break applications because they were implicitly depending on the order of things, even though it wasn't guaranteed. And so there were, 1,000 little details like that were incidentally the way that Angular happened to execute, but nothing that, should have been dependent on. We had to kind of do backflips because we had a brand new algorithm, but it had to run in the exact same order as the old algorithm. So even if it was not as easy to implement or even slower, we had to do it that way for backwards compatibility.
That led to Angular 8.0, I think, where you could try Ivy. There was an opt-in flag, and then 9.0 where it became the default experience. So we shipped Ivy, right? Party, celebration, woohoo. Except it wasn't turned on at Google. And it wasn't turned on at Google because although we had handled quite a bit of the migration challenges for the runtime behaviors, it turned out that Ivy poked at some things in the way Google built JavaScript that made it very challenging to transition the Google infrastructure, the whole Google code base, onto Ivy. And that project took several years beyond the initial public release.
Internally at Google, we have something called the churn policy, which essentially states that when an infrastructure team like Angular tries to make a big breaking change, such as enabling Ivy, we can't just kick this over the fence. We can't just say, hey, Ivy flag exists, all the application teams go enable it and set that on, and then we're going to delete Vue Engine in 6 months. The challenge doesn't really work that way. And instead, what the churn policy states is that we can't do that. We actually have to take the time and energy to migrate all Angular applications in Google. And at the time, there were probably 2,500 applications, Angular apps in Google that needed to be migrated. When we sort of shipped out Ivy externally, a lot of people complained, being like, this is a lot of work, there's all these breaking changes we have to manage, and it's kind of a pain. And I looked at that and I'm like, yeah, I know it was kind of a pain. I had to do it 2,500 times.
It felt like it was a project that the Angular team was overwhelmed by a little bit, for me as like a community member. So I got scared, quite honestly, because I was at that time, 8 years I was working with Angular. My skill set, literally the first thing in my CV said Angular. That was the thing that I had a proven track record of, okay, that is a skill that I can showcase. Will Angular survive as a framework through this hard period where you see other frameworks delivering feature after new use cases that they come up with? And Angular being stuck with, hey, we have this commitment on Ivy, was scary.
We're all very aware of people saying stuff like, oh, well, Angular's dead, and oh, don't ever use Angular. It's really disheartening to be on a team that you're excited about to, hear that kind of sentiment. On the high positive side of Ivy, it did end up delivering what it kind of promised, where with Ivy landing, we were able to give Angular all these features that we couldn't before. And we could iterate on it faster and give all this new stuff that everybody was excited about possibly building at the time that the community was asking for. as much as that like 3 years of toil of working through Ivy was difficult for the team and difficult for the community, I think in the end it ended up being worth it. But I know we wouldn't do it again. Like we certainly learned the hard way not to take on projects in that way.
We had two of the like kind of core engineers step down, right, and go on to other ventures, right? But I think for the value of the community, everyone just kept going. And I think what Ben was talking about, how, you know, they didn't really like act like that, like, I made this is my house, you know, I'm gone, it's gone. Like, it wasn't that energy, right? I mean, it's pretty accurate. And so just not having that, I think, let us continue to find out, even as a core team, like we got to find out what would happen next ourselves. Like we got to experience it and figure out what we would do. Everything is great. React is great. Svelte is great. Vue is great. Solid is great. You can't really make a bad choice. So then how do you differentiate yourself when you can't make a bad choice? You just continue to be the best that you can be at the things that you're really good at. And that's what we were focused on. And I think that's what allowed us to kind of survive the change, you know, such a big change, right, in our whole space.
The leadership came from the Google team that said, like, we're going to keep the light on, but the community rallied around and say, yeah, if you keep the light on, we are here.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that for something that is so broadly used within Google, and for something that obviously has such a value to developers and developer trust in the external ecosystem, what I saw was that there was not a connection between their worth, their real worth, and people understanding that worth above. And so what I tried to do was articulate that and try to draw that connection. I wrote a paper called Angular, Google's Underfed Golden Goose, which was about like, hey, this is a team and a group and a framework that derives great value within Google. It is the most used framework at Google. It also derives a lot of worth for all of these other people. We have a few paths to consider here. We can run things in maintenance mode, we can do, you know, not invest, or we could reinvest and revitalize this project. And, you know, I think people got really excited about that, like people above, in a way that they weren't excited before. And I think there was just a lack of articulation at that time through nobody's, like, there's no ill intent there, but I think that there was just a missed mark. And so I just tried to draw that connection a little bit more clearly so that people understood this is something that has massive value to Google. So I came in and started talking to the team, and they were just so thoughtful and energetic and hardworking and wonderful to talk to. It's weird to say, like, I was surprised by it, but I was really surprised. They were so welcoming. And not only just welcoming of, like, having me be there, but were genuinely excited about hearing my perspective coming from another community. So as I was talking to the team, I, you know, was excited to learn more about the history of the framework and like why they had made some of the decisions that they had. So, and asked, like, would it be okay if I, you know, asked you a bunch of questions around what was going on there? And they said, yeah. So I wrote a paper called Babby's First Angular. So I made a bunch of Angular applications, and I moved a bunch of my Vue applications to Angular 2 and to Angular as well. And then also just ask questions along the way, like, you know, you've invested in Zone for reactivity, and it can be kind of noisy when you check the world. Tell me about that. What do you still believe in that as a strategy? In asking all those questions, they gave me very honest takes, like, yeah, we've really actually been considering revamping the reactivity system because of that. What do you like about other reactivity systems? And we get in this like long conversation about things. And so that was really, those conversations were really fruitful. I think they were really fruitful in us talking together about what a new kind of strategic direction could be, what opportunities lay ahead. It was at a time when Ivy was wrapping up, which is great. It was like very much like, okay, we have this time and this chance. What's next?
COVID happened and Angular transitioned to kind of working from home for a while. We became a much more remote team. There was a period of time, less than a year, but I think not much less, where we didn't actually have any in-person interaction. So there was a moment in 2021 where we were able to do this for the first time, to sit down in a room together. And one of the exercises we did was, I called it a design review 10 years later. This idea that we would take a look back at the framework and see what was working and what wasn't, and talk about kind of some of the problems and the things that we would like to tackle. And one of the themes that came up consistently throughout this was reactivity. In Angular, the original kind of design of the framework was based on Zone.js, that you as an application developer could just put your state anywhere you wanted to in whatever shape objects, whether it's in services or inside of components, and you could change it however you wanted and the framework would figure it out, right? It would do this diffing operation and realize that you changed something and update the UI. And over time, what we noticed was that as you scaled your applications up, that model kind of had some performance problems. It could be very performant, but it was also very easy to do things that ended up causing, many change detection cycles or things like that. At the same time, we had this additional model in Angular that I would call like on-push change detection. And we noticed that the applications that were the most successful at managing their performance and keeping it in the good zone while they were scaling was the applications that were building on top of on-push change detection, using RxJS as this messenger of telling the framework, hey, I'm updating this specific value, you need to know where it's changing. But there was an interesting kind of gap here where Angular wasn't fully utilizing the information that it was getting from RxJS, from the notifications there, because it was still under the hood doing this dirty checking operation. Doing this, yes, you notified me that you changed this component, that's great. I'm still going to go and check the rest of the world just because. So the framework really was not paying attention to the notification in the same way as a reactive framework would. As we started investigating reactivity, we realized that if we actually built this into the framework, if we had a mechanism where you could communicate to the framework exactly what has changed, and the framework were to pay attention, that you could achieve kind of much more optimal performance than we were getting today.
One of the things that was very clear to us that we want to have a reactivity system that can be used anywhere, can be used in a template, can be used in a service or anywhere in any TypeScript file. That the reactivity system cannot be confined just to components. If you decide that your state no longer belongs to a component and you want to move it somewhere else to share it between two different components, you shouldn't change the paradigm. You shouldn't refactor your code in a drastic way. There were only two solutions in the technical space, either RxJS observables or signals. And the way we're talking about it in our conversation with Alex, that RxJS is aware about all events and they can happen over time. So all of a sudden, you've got operators that can buffer events. Or I can wait for 5 events to arrive, or maybe I can wait for 5 seconds to pass. You've got tools to actually work with time. That's powerful, but it also contributes to this perceived difficulty of learning RxJS. Like there are so many operators, so many capabilities. And essentially for the state management, you usually mostly need only one operator, which is map or derivation. And this is essentially what signals are doing. They are much simpler in nature. This is different, primitive in nature, because they completely bypass the notion of time. Saying like, I've got a value for you, it can change. I will not tell you when it changed, but I will allow you to do something in change. And when we kind of understood the fundamental difference between a stream of events and just the value that changes over time, that was like, oh yeah, that's obvious, right? Like this is the different animal, this is the different primitive, and this is what we want to use to manage state, because that's the problem of the state management. Essentially, I reached out to Ryan. They're like, hey, you know, I'm working on Angular. I can see that you're working on another framework. Maybe we should chat.
He was so excited. He wanted to talk to me about all things reactivity. He'd read some articles, and he saw that from his perspective, although I don't want to speak for him completely, that Angular was being viewed as kind of a legacy framework in certain ways from the outside world, and he felt that we needed to do something to change that. And he thought part of it was to just look at what other frameworks were doing, and he got really interested in the reactivity models that we were using. It was a huge win from my perspective to see Angular adopt Signals. Some of the old React core team members even came out of the woodwork on places like Tech Twitter to actually kind of like defend the decisions that were made. Like this is the first time in a very long time that I saw the discussion return to that philosophical point that was present back when React was first introduced back in 2013-14. Some people might look at my willingness to help others as like, aren't they the competitor? Isn't that a strange thing to do? But like at a certain point, I'd done so much education on the topic, and you know, really just wanted to see these patterns succeed. I think the picture here is bigger than the particular frameworks. And most importantly, I want these ideas to propagate and survive, right? There was a time period when React first came out that these ideas were almost completely dead. I never want to see that happen again. I think there are viable alternative here with Signals, and I'm glad others are starting to agree.
I don't think that innovation is possible without learning from one another. In terms of, you know, making that an intentional choice, I think as long as you're intrinsically motivated, things like that just naturally happen. I'm not sure it's like, oh, we've got to go talk to Ryan Carnato, or oh, we've got to go talk to Rich. But it's always good to do those things if you're motivated to learn and grow. When you want to learn, when you want to approach something with humility and say, maybe I don't know everything, maybe I need to learn from somebody else. And so I think that that's what the team is really good at, is saying like, you know, I think that this is a good way, but maybe I should seek out other opinions. Maybe I should be open to other ways of working and looking at this. And massive props to people like Ryan for working across framework boundaries. He doesn't have to do that. He works on Solid. He doesn't have to help the Angular team. I think that that's a huge sign of health in the industry, and also I'm very thankful for his approach.
All right, we're really excited to be here today. And yeah, welcome to NGConf 2024. So most of you may not know this, but inside of Google we have one more framework called Wiz. Going forward, Angular and Wiz are going to be working together even more closely, sharing more code. And working together on this will help us year after year to continue making progress on making Angular better for everyone.
Wiz is an internal Google framework that is used by Google Search, Google Photos, and Payments, among others. It's a framework that focuses on products that really need high performance. The strategy here is to open source the parts of Wiz that make sense and open source them through Angular. Now seemed like the right time to start converging these technologies because we started getting a lot of requests from Wiz and Angular users for features that the other framework needed. Both teams started exploring Signals independently. And then we realized that the Wiz team was basically re-implementing a lot of what the Angular team had already done for Signals. And so we just encouraged the teams to maybe try to explore that. And if that worked, that could be the proving ground that maybe convergence is possible. Today, 100% of the YouTube mobile web app is using Angular Signals. This is the same library that the Angular and the Wiz teams built together and is currently in the Angular's open source repo. So for everyone who's sort of wondering whether Angular is going to survive in the future, this convergence story, if all goes well, and if we're able to put all the features that Wiz has into Angular, means that Angular will be powering Google Search. And if that's sort of not a demonstration of Google's commitment towards Angular or the need for Angular to stay, then I don't know what is.
We're not going to stop working on Angular and Wiz and just stay on the same place and like converge the frameworks in the next like 3-4 years without delivering anything. That's actually the big difference compared to Ivy. We're not going to stop and only focus on convergence. We're going to keep convergence in mind, but also we're going to listen to what developers need in our developer satisfaction surveys on GitHub, and also what big customers such as YouTube and Google Search want. We're going to find the overlap between these two, and we're going to unify on these specific features until we eventually turn into the same framework. We are making consistent small steps, and every single step is making the framework a little bit better. It is not one huge leap where we are just jumping in a random direction. We have been following the same principles that we have for our team, and we have been making consistent progress, which has been increasing the momentum around the evolution of Angular. The framework evolved a lot. It is no longer the framework that it used to be 2010 for sure, and it is not the framework that AngularJS was back in 2010, and not the framework that Angular 2 was in 2016. It's a new framework with new features that are very future-looking. So we also worked on new documentation, making sure that the learning journey is smooth and people can start incrementally adopting Angular as they need it. So I guess that's what the Angular Renaissance is about. It's about new features, listening to users and building the framework transparently, and smoothing the learning journey so that developers can actually get their Angular applications up and running pretty quickly.
It is one of the most exciting times to be working on Angular, and it's both because of our code base health, but also because of the team that we get to work with and the community that we get to interact with. I think it's actually a very special moment in the history of Angular. There's always inherent complexity that we're gonna have to deal with as a team, but I think we're in a very good place right now where there's a level of health into our code base, there's a level of health within our team, and there's a level of health within our leadership as well. Like we have Sarah's support in a way that I don't know if in the past it was true. Obviously, I didn't have that experience. And I think that also matters a lot. So I think it's both a technical and people situation. And the team has grown so much, right? A lot of folks on the team have been working on Angular since before Angular 2 was released. So there was a ton of learnings throughout this process that enables us to be better about how do we think about trade-offs and how do we make decisions. And I think that plays a lot into what we're able to accomplish today.
The Renaissance is real. That's a quote. That's a quote. I'll just throw it out there. I think it's a fancy term, but I do think that it has shown where Angular has come over the years as far as where it was. Like Ivy took a long time. I thought for a while that maybe it wasn't going to recover from that because a lot of people like left, and we didn't know if Ivy was even worth it for what we were getting. But now if we look today to see what kind of those things that Ivy unlocked, I think that the Renaissance is a result of those things. So I'm looking forward to see what comes next, or even if it unlocks more things.
During the Ivy rewrite and afterward, there was not much happening from the IDE side of things for Angular. The APIs were stable. There wasn't much changing back then. So we're kind of put Angular plugin in the maintenance mode. But I'm always was like, when can I go back to Angular? And with what recently has happened with Angular, I'm super glad to be back full-time on supporting Angular. Angular blocks syntax was wow, it was great. And it was so much fun to support it because you had to do some lexer, you had to do some parsing. Also, like standalone components required us to update inspections, to add quick fixes, and update the model building. But it was fun to develop. So I was really glad to be back on supporting Angular with these new cool features.
So whether if you use Angular or not, it's hard to not see what we're doing and at least notice. Here's the secret behind it all, I think. We are in tune with our community. We are an evidence-based team, right? So we look at the evidence, we take feedback, we do surveys. We are like in tune with that community. And being there lets us hear with a way that I don't know if we've ever been able to hear before, like listen and gather that feedback, and then it helps us to drive our decisions. Because now we're thinking, how do we serve our developers? And when you're like service-oriented in your mindset for your community, it's just hard to lose.
We try to avoid disrupting developers where we can. And I think that investing in that reputation for us has really paid off. When we do something like teasing, we have a big announcement coming, people get to be excited instead of worried because hopefully people know and have internalized, we're not going to rewrite the whole thing again, right? We're not going to cause some giant migration. We're focused on evolving the framework while also bringing all of our developer community along with us. And so when we have something big to announce, it's something more exciting than scary.
I definitely see an increase in popularity with Angular. I think hand in hand, it also happened that React kind of sees a decrease in popularity with recent decisions around React Server components. And that's my outsider's perspective from like not being closely involved in the React community. But React is going through like an AngularJS, Angular 2 phase with server components. While Angular being like, oh yeah, we have this new feature here and you can use it for free. And React being like, it's not really for free. You know, it's kind of difficult to get into. I think this was just a very lucky moment for Angular to gain popularity in the framework ecosystem.
We did have some concerns about Angular losing its talent and losing its steam, frankly, with the community. I mean, there was a period where it felt like React won objectively over Angular, and it was hard to hire people. But ultimately, we stuck through with Angular, and I think that Angular is getting back to their early days. It feels like an Angular renaissance is coming, and there is more and more great updates being released by the Angular team. So we're more confident than we have been.
It's interesting how frameworks rise and fall. Angular became a very enterprisey framework, but what was being taught at schools, at boot camps, by self-paced learners were frameworks that could be learned as a whole, you might say, in a week or two. Whether or not they were capable of doing the same thing for 500,000 lines of code wasn't important. And now we're coming a little bit full circle because we're seeing that Angular is simplifying things in ways that make it more approachable, simpler to get to. Angular is the Keanu Reeves of frameworks. It had an amazing beginning. It had an interesting slowing middle, and then suddenly it's exciting again.
The beginning of the new era of Angular, that's how I see it. Angular has been, the JavaScript ecosystem overall has been a very volatile place. Like there were new frameworks every other month. There was a meme saying, oh, I've been in coma for 2 minutes. I can't wait to try the new JavaScript framework, which is no longer the case. You see that there are a couple of frameworks that have become the de facto standard for building web interfaces. And my mindset also changed a little bit since the last interview, since we released version 17. Now I totally see Angular coming back. With version 17, I mean, we had the most successful live stream. I have like a couple of podcasts a week, people being excited about Angular, what we're building and what is happening with the convergence of Wiz. Just Angular seems reborn, seems like a phoenix to an extent, like reborn from the ashes. And this is pretty exciting to see. It is really exciting to be part of it.
I always wanted Angular to be self-sustaining or sustainable, and I feared that there were like so many moments throughout Angular where tomorrow was like the last day of Angular. At least that's how many of us felt. And now looking at the team and seeing that things are going well. The team is cutting new releases, is working on great things. The community is excited about what is happening. People keep on believing in Angular and investing in building applications with Angular. It's great to see that.
Leaving the Angular team was like leaving my family, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. For a long time, I didn't look back because it was painful. It was painful to look at. I felt like, in some way I'd abandoned some folks. And as I check in now, it's amazing and super rewarding to see that Angular has found fresh direction in ways like I would never have predicted. They've maintained the passion and what Angular was originally trying to strive for. They've refound their footing, I think. And I couldn't be happier.